Hello everyone, I'm meteorologist Johanna Wagstaffe. Thanks for joining on Facebook and YouTube. I'm answering questions today as part of our water series. Our Margaret Evans has been reporting the past couple of days from Cape Town. But many Canadians might not think with such an abundance of water here in our own country that we too might be facing water shortages, and we've already been seeing problems with water supply across some watersheds and communities across the country. So if you have any questions about our water across Canada, please feel free to send a question my way. We actually have a number of different watersheds across the country. We are already getting a taste of what our future might look like thanks to climate change as it alters our water systems, and thanks to a growing population and a growing demand for water usage. Canadians use on average about 250 litres per day for an individual, and that's the second highest per capita usage anywhere in the world, only second to the US. To put that into context, Cape Town on their restrictions right now use about 50 litres a day. So we're using 5 times what Cape Town residents are using. We have about 595 watersheds across the country. Just to give you a little bit of background, I wanted to take you to this map to show you where all of our watersheds are. And I think it's kind of interesting for you to maybe figure out what watershed you live in. And this is basically a watershed is where all of the accumulating rainfall and snow melt runs down through the water systems, the streams, the tributaries, and ends up at a common outflow point like a bay, a lake, or an ocean. So we've got 595 of them across the country, and you can actually head to Protect Your Watershed and find out which one you live in. So say you're in Southern Ontario, you can zoom into this map and find out what your watershed is. So here's Kawartha Lakes. You can find out if there's a watershed below you or above you. And I think it just really sort of helps to add context when it comes to figuring out where our water comes from and why we might be running out of it when we have so much water. So here in Vancouver, where I'm talking to you from, we actually have 3 watersheds where we get our drinking water from, and that supplies drinking water to about 2.5 million residents. So I actually got to go up with Metro Vancouver in their helicopter. They're the group that manages the watersheds and the drinking water, and they measure the snowpacks up in our mountains. That's really where we get the bulk of our drinking water from rain and melting snowpack. And they've been seeing some big changes over the past few decades because of climate change. And climate change is impacting Canadians in different ways, but generally it means we're getting less snow and more rain events, and it's shifting our seasons, and all of that has a big impact on how that water is distributed through our different watersheds. I'm going to talk more about that, but I'm already getting some great questions. Amber comments, Vancouver and BC don't know what water scarcity is. Try looking towards Cape Town, who has run out, California that has regular droughts, and Australia. Yeah, interesting comment. It's true. A lot of experts think that we don't have harsh enough water restrictions and regulations in place right now. We're starting to get a taste of that. Here in Vancouver in 2015, we had a drought summer that followed a low snowpack year. So we actually had one of our biggest water scares. Our reservoirs dropped below half, and we had our harshest water restrictions in place for only the second time in a century. And most climate models show that we will be getting less snow and more rain events. We're going to be seeing more variability. We're going to have to figure out more ways to capture rainfall instead of snowfall that melts over a longer period of time that supplies our reservoirs. Instead, we're getting it in these big rainfall events, or we're getting big snow years followed by big drought years. It's probably something many of you can relate to. There are wild swings that happen from season to season thanks to climate change. So yeah, a lot of experts, Amber, just to react, say that we do need to look to other countries like Cape Town and California that have seen extreme drought years because our climate is changing in that way. Philip Giglio asks, is a watershed like a water closet? Yeah, watersheds you can think of as sort of a naturally occurring basin, and it's different for everywhere across the country. As I showed you from our watershed map, I'm just going to zoom out. It's sort of, you can think of it like a water basin. It's where the water naturally runs when it rains or when we get a big snow and it melts. And naturally, all of that water, I mean, some of it ends up underground, some of it evaporates, but generally it all runs out to a common outflow point. And across the country, we have many of these outflow points. We have Hudson Bay, we have both of our oceans, and we have the Great Lakes. But as you can see, there are massive amounts of watersheds. You know, we can head up all the way to northern Quebec and see which way the water flows in these naturally occurring basins. In order to capture that water from those basins, we've built reservoirs, or some of them are naturally occurring, but in many cases we've dammed the water so we can hold that and supply it as drinking water. So most of these watersheds come with a reservoir or a man-made or naturally occurring basin and a dam. And of course, one solution is to build more of these reservoirs and dams if we need to manage that flow better as we get less snow and more rain in general. And in some cases in the Rockies, the problem is less ice as we're losing our glaciers. The problem with building more reservoirs and dams, of course, is it not only costs a lot of money, but big impact to wildlife and ecosystems, especially when you're managing water flows. It's a big concern out here when it comes to our salmon population. These are great questions, by the way, and if you're just joining us on Facebook Live or YouTube, I'm meteorologist Johanna Wagstaffe, and I'm answering your water questions as part of our water series, particularly our water problems here in Canada. Let's see, Marcus Strodes asks, what will happen if the water runs out? So this is a big concern across the watersheds, the 595 watersheds across the country. As I mentioned, I was up in Metro Vancouver's helicopter with their monitoring team, and this is something they're already thinking about because we did have a taste of what happens when our reservoirs get very low. What happens when our reservoirs get below a certain threshold, that's when communities implement restrictions. Back in 2015, Vancouver implemented stage 3, which is the highest water restrictions, the harshest water restrictions. And that means things like no watering the car, you can't water the lawns, different kinds of restrictions on how we use water. In Cape Town, they've actually gone to some pretty extreme restrictions. For example, actually controlling the drip that comes out of the faucet, controlling the number of liters you can actually take home with you in jugs and bottles. So there are always more restrictions we can put in place when those reservoirs get down to a certain level. But here in Canada, that is definitely something we're worried about when it comes to individual watersheds, because as I mentioned, climate change is changing the way that we're getting water when it trickles down into our reservoirs. So tighter restrictions is one solution. Building more reservoirs and dams is another solution. A third one that I think we all need to be talking a lot more about is just generally managing our water conservation better. And as individuals, thinking about how much water we use in a day. As I mentioned, we use more water per capita as individuals than anyone else in the world, second only to the United States. Stephanie Rose asks, what is the website for this watershed map? So this is National Geographic Protect Your Watershed. If you just Google Canadian watersheds, you should be able to get to this map. And again, this is showing you the 595 watersheds across the country. Let's see if I can zoom out here. And you can find out which watershed you're connected to. And you can then figure out what your watershed is called, and then you can go to that individual website. And every watershed is managed by a separate region, community, or city. And you can find out what your rules and regulations are for your individual watershed. But really puts things into perspective, you know, especially with all these unique microclimates and geography across the country, all filtering water through different channels. Let's see, Vancouver Island well drilling on Facebook comments, we see many wells go dry every year, both Vancouver Island and the Fraser Valley. Many areas appear to be dewatering. Yeah, that's another interesting topic. So most of us get our drinking water from watersheds, but we also tap into groundwater across the country in wells. And this is also a big concern as we move from naturally falling and trickling down water systems to actually digging down below the ground to access that water table. And climate change is also changing where that water table sits. And it's a problem that has occurred in other parts of the world where we draw too much water from the water table, and that can lead to other issues like subsidence on the ground, sinkholes, and also depleting the groundwater. So that is another issue that Canada is already having to think about. Antonia Winkleman asks, are there strict enough laws in place to protect the water? We are the envy of many countries around the world when it comes to our fresh water, but a lot of experts are saying that our water restrictions aren't harsh enough. I keep using 2015 as an example here in Vancouver. That's the one that I was really following when I went up with the team in the helicopter to view our watersheds from above. And in 2015, we put those restrictions in place, and we were able to very quickly raise the level of our water reservoir. So it does make a big impact when we're talking about conserving the different ways that we use water. And when these restrictions are put in place, we really see dramatic improvements. Of course, there are other aspects. Industry and agriculture have to follow a separate set of guidelines, and that is a big part of our water usage. But definitely experts say these restrictions need to go in sooner and faster and perhaps be harsher. But the other big part of this problem, again, we've sort of got three different solutions here. We've got harsher water restrictions for when we do have drought years. We've got changing the infrastructure of our reservoirs and dams so that we can collect water better. And we've also got general water conservation. I think that's the big one, is changing the way we think about how we use water as Canadians, using 5 times more water right now than Cape Town. I think over time we really need to just think about water in different ways, and that is something that doesn't end at watersheds or borders across our country. Sven Becker asks, what about all the water going down south? Yeah, really interesting question. Many of our tributaries and watersheds end up filtering down across the U.S. border. And this is something that we have a lot of treaties and agreements in place along the Canada-U.S. border, things that I know officials and communities are already thinking about as we start to see the impact of climate change and population growth. The U.S. does rely heavily on Canada's water, and that is going to be a big challenge moving forward. I've heard a lot of experts talk about water as the #1 commodity in just a few short decades. Interestingly, here in British Columbia, we've got one of the longest and oldest water treaties between British Columbia and Washington because of our Columbia River that moves from BC down towards Washington. And they've already indicated, the U.S. has indicated that they want to renegotiate the terms of that contract as our stream flow lessens going from BC to Washington. As we're getting less snow across the province, that means less water trickling down through the river systems in a slow way. Rather, we're getting all of that snow as extreme rainfall events all at once. So they're already wanting to negotiate how we manage that water, and that's something that we're going to have to think about very closely, especially when it comes to impacting our ecosystems and our salmon populations and everything that will be affected when we try and manually manage river and water flow. These are great questions. Again, I'm meteorologist Johanna Wagstaffe. If you're just joining us on Facebook Live or YouTube, I'm answering Canada's water questions as part of our water series. I was up with Metro Vancouver a couple of weeks ago looking at our watersheds, and I've really seen the changes to Canada's snowpack when it comes to climate change. And ultimately, even though not everyone gets their water across the country from snow, everyone's impacted by a shift in seasons. And generally, climate change for Canada does mean less snow and less ice up in the north and up in the mountains, and that has a huge impact on the trickle-down effects of what actually comes out of our tap in the end. Joseph Newton asks, desalination is going and already becoming huge business. This is the trigger event which is going to propel the industry, I should say. You bring up a really great point, Joseph. One thing I haven't talked about is technology, and that's something that other parts of the world that have experienced continuous drought years, like California and Cape Town, are really experimenting with, is technology like desalination plants. And this is something that I think we might end up having to look towards, especially when we're surrounded 3 sides by oceans. 90% of our fresh water comes from the Great Lake basins. We may have to figure out how to tap in to the oceans in the end, and I know Canada will be looking to countries that are experimenting with this technology already. Farhan Adra asks, should we be worried about water shortages? The short answer is yes. I think Canadians need to start thinking about water shortages as we get more and more extreme seasons. Our seasons are shifting because of climate change, and we are using more water as our population and industry and agricultural demands grow. And so we really need to think about how we're using our water. And I think there is a reason to be concerned, or at least to learn more about your own watershed. Figure out what watershed you're a part of. Think about how you use water in a day. This is a message that most experts and scientists are putting out to the public. And I know a lot of scientists who manage their individual watersheds. I spoke to the Okanagan watershed district last summer, and they're already having to think about how they're going to transform the way they use water in the BC interior, an area that is going to see more and more drought-like conditions at the same time that we're growing more and more agriculture up north as sort of the climate shifts from California up towards BC. We're going to have greater demand for water, but we're going to have less of it. So yeah, there is a concern, but Canadians on a positive side are already thinking about it. A lot of experts and individuals are already taking this seriously. And as I mentioned, water restrictions have a huge positive impact on raising our water levels back up in our reservoirs. Let's see, these are good ones here. What is BC government doing to lower water usage? That comes from Lucy Casey. I'm not sure of the exact details, but again, each watershed is managed by a different region. So Metro Vancouver manages the drinking water for 2.5 million residents here in Vancouver. And going up with their team and getting to see how they measure those snow samples, how they monitor water levels, how they decide to manage the dam and the inflow and outflow of that water in their reservoirs that ends up getting out to the residents. That's all done on an individual regional basis because there are so many different issues. I mean, for the Vancouver watershed, for example, talking to the team, they think a lot about the impact on our wildlife and our ecosystems and our salmon population. We also have to think about earthquakes here on the West Coast. So actually happening right now, we're getting seismic upgrades on 2 of our big tunnels that takes the drinking water from the North Shore reservoirs down towards the Lower Mainland where I am. So they're seismically upgrading those. The reservoirs and dams just went through a big seismic upgrade a few years ago. So individual concerns for each region based on usage, geography, as well as how climate change is individually impacting those watersheds. That's why watersheds are all managed individually. However, the concept of water conservation should be one that doesn't stop at watershed boundaries, and it's one that I think the federal government is working on to come up with a more cohesive strategy. Neil Herzog comments, doesn't it rain 8 months a year here in Vancouver? Yes, very good point. And this is, I think, an illusion that a lot of us have here in Metro Vancouver. We are surrounded by water, and yes, we have a lot of rainfall within a season here in Metro Vancouver. But the problem is we need to capture that rainfall in some sort of way. And because most of it is captured up in the mountains and naturally filters down downslope into our rivers and streams and eventually out towards the ocean, we have to capture that water along the way. But if we're only getting it as rain, you end up trying to hold these big basins where evaporation is a problem, extreme rainfall and precipitation events are a problem, and you have to really manage that outflow of the water when you're getting it all coming as rain. The great thing about snow is that it locks up our drinking water for most months of the year. So we're getting right now a lot of snow on our local mountains. Talking to the Metro Vancouver team, this is a good snow year for Metro Vancouver, even though they're seeing more variability between seasons. This is a good year. We've got lots of snow in our local mountains. All of that snow, once it melts in our springtime between basically May and October, that becomes our drinking water, which is why snowpack is so important. And even for other watersheds across the country where you're not directly relying on mountain snow, you're relying on the snow and glaciers farther north in our provinces, and all of that trickles down through the various watersheds. So even though rain is an important part of our drinking water, snow and ice, I would say, are even more important. And most climate projections show that, especially here in BC, we're going to be getting more rain than snow. In fact, in Vancouver, our wettest day will be 10 times wetter in just 3 decades, which might sound like a good thing for our water conservation efforts, but that means about a 25% drop in snowpack in 3 decades. So a lot more rain, a lot less snow, and we're going to have to manage that. Let's see. Mark E.S. Bernard asks, Can we use some other technologies to stop fires instead of fresh water? Yeah, interesting thought, especially coming out of British Columbia's worst fire season ever. 2017 saw the most evacuations and the most hectares or acres burnt across the province. And we do use a lot of water to fight fires. I'm not sure what the percentage of our water usage is when compared to what we use at home as individuals, but I do think the bigger issue is still what we use as individuals and what we use for industry and agricultural purposes. Amazingly, when it comes down to individual usage in your homes, and there's some great information and tools online. Margaret Everins' piece, in fact, I'm going to take you there right now, is an excellent piece to read. She was looking into the crisis in Cape Town, and she kind of goes through the personal use in North America versus Cape Town. Interestingly, I didn't realize this. For individual usage, toilet flushing uses the most fresh water, followed by showers, what you use out of your faucet, laundry, and then general leaks. So I think more so than fighting fires, we're using most of our water as individuals in our own homes. Farhan Edra asks, can you tell us in Canada where and how we're wasting more water? Yeah, again, if you head to CBC News, and you can check out Margaret Everins' piece. She was looking into the water crisis in Cape Town, but she does a really nice comparison of our water usage here in North America versus Cape Town. And we really are using a lot of water in our own homes and outside of our homes, washing cars, gardens, sprinklers. In 2015, when Vancouver had our sort of water crisis and we got our reservoirs down below half for the first time in modern history, only the second time we've had these water restrictions in place, we did have very strict restrictions, and the city turned off a lot of their public water services, the water parks, the water fountains, watering of public gardens and parks. That was all shut off in the summer of 2015, and a lot of experts say that is a real taste of what our summers here will look like in just a few short decades. And it was sort of eerie. I mean, many of you have probably experienced a summer or a season where you've had less rain than normal. I mean, this is all part of the natural variability of seasons, but we're seeing that variability come in more extreme dosages. So back in 2015, it was kind of eerie to see everything in Vancouver just turn brown because no one was watering everything. And an interesting concept that we just got a bit of a taste of in 2015 was the idea of drought shaming, something that has happened a lot in California. When somebody sees their neighbor misusing water, when we've got water restrictions in place, they'll post a picture online or report them so that they get the fines. And it is something that people around the world are taking seriously, especially when you are in one of those drought summers. I've got time for a few more questions. If you're just joining us, I'm meteorologist Johanna Wagstaffe, taking your questions on Canada's drinking water as part of our water series. Elizabeth Greco asks, I'm from a fracking state of Pennsylvania. How much fracking is going on in Vancouver? Yeah, interesting question. I don't have the numbers on exactly how much fracking is going on in British Columbia. Most of our fracking is happening across the border in Alberta, but it is happening even more in the United States. And there is a lot of research and studies being done right now on the implication of using water to help extract things from the earth. And that is, again, something that officials here are watching the U.S. very closely to see how much water is being used there and what that's doing to our ground level supply and to our drinking water supply. So many different angles when we talk about drinking water. It's not just what falls from the sky, it's also, are we tapping into the groundwater? And it's this usage concept. I mean, we're using more water now because of population growth and industry and agriculture demand, and that trend is expected to go up at the same time that climate change will continue to shift and change our seasons. I think we've got a couple more questions. William Fung asks, which levels of government have the jurisdictions to legislate on the use of water and the building codes on plumbing? So in Canada, I'm not sure what level that comes down to, but again, the management of the watersheds is done on an individual regional basis. And when water restrictions are put in place, again, that happens on a regional basis with direction from both provincial and federal governments. When it comes to the building codes on plumbing, I'm not sure. I know that there are a team of engineers that are part of Canada's building codes, and those codes do get updated every few years with the various risks and the research that we have going into those risks, seismic upgrades, and I'm sure things like how to better conserve and manage our water will go into those building codes as well. I know many cities across the country are aiming for becoming green in a short amount of years. I mean, Vancouver, we're hoping to do it in just a couple of years, go carbon neutral, becoming the greenest city in North America. And a lot of that will come down to how we manage our building codes and how efficient we can be with new buildings. I think the third or fourth on the list of how we're wasting water in our own homes is dripping faucets. And the concept of using gray water and recycling the water that runs off the roof and through toilets flushing is something that a lot of new buildings are using anyway, because it saves money in the long run. And I think that's what it'll really come down to, is all of the ways that we can save money also saves us money. And often in the end, the bottom line is what will provoke change. Question from Bamashi McGizzy. In central Ontario, the weather has been changing drastically. I hear ya. We get more snow this year than last year. El Nino has these type of impacts. It's true, these big large-scale oscillations that change the weather around the world, like El Nino and La Nina, that's when the water temperature or the winds in the central equatorial Pacific changes the water temperatures in the equatorial Pacific. That changes weather patterns all around the world. So yes, we are going to naturally see variability in our seasons based on whether we're in an El Nino or a La Nina year. But the problem with climate change is it just raises the baseline for all of that. So while we still will get variability, we'll still get drought years, we'll still get heavy snow years, we'll still get cold years, but we're going to see more variability, and the baseline is going to continue to shift upwards. So yeah, Ontario is seeing some pretty extreme weather this year. I think parts of Ontario have seen more snow this year than all of last year. And some much colder temperatures as well. Again, all of this comes down to how we're going to have to manage our snow and rain in the future, because extreme weather events are becoming more common. Many new climate research studies show that climate change is in the end meaning less snow for most of Canada, but more extreme rainfall events. So we're getting this shift in season. Our melt is happening earlier. We're getting longer, drier periods in the summer, and we're seeing more heavy downpours rather than consistent events over the course of the year. Okay, I think I've got time for one more question. Before I take that, I just want to show you one other graph. I keep referring to 2015 here in Metro Vancouver as one of our record drought years. So the city of Vancouver, Metro Vancouver, publishes basically a graph showing you what our reservoir levels are at. And we've got sort of this envelope of normal range. So this is from May through to November. This is the time of the year where we're really tapping into our snowpack melt. So they published this graph during our spring to fall months when we're seeing that snowpack melt. Here's total storage on the left, and this is the envelope of sort of safe operating where our reservoir levels we're comfortable with. In 2015, I don't know if you can see that gray line, we were below that safe envelope line. So we got below half of our total reservoir. And talking to the team from Metro Vancouver who measures the snow, we were up at one of the alpine stations a couple of weeks ago, and the snow was almost 5 meters deep. They said in 2015, standing on that same spot, it was just a foot or so high. And those are the kinds of variabilities we're going to have to deal with more through each of our watersheds and in different challenging ways. Okay, I'm going to take one more question. Sylvester Law asks, how much of Canada's fresh water supply is renewable? Yeah, interesting question. Most of our fresh water comes from the Great Lakes Basin, which is using fresh water from glacial melt, and that is not totally that is not a renewable clean water supply. We do have again access to a lot of lakes and rivers. We are the envy of many parts of the world, and we are surrounded by water, but it isn't a renewable source. You know, we can tap into it and continue to drain our lakes and the groundwater levels, and sure, we'll get the water cycle continuing to replenish that with snow and rain, but ultimately we may see a decrease in our fresh water over time. And that's why conservation is really important, because changing the infrastructure of those reservoirs and dams are going to have big consequences, and it's going to come at a big cost. Water restrictions work, but it would be nice if we were just always thinking about how to conserve water and sort of didn't have to get to these extremes like we're seeing in Cape Town. I'm going to try and send you some information afterwards, so I'll comment back to some of your questions on Facebook and YouTube, but thank you very much for joining me today. And I'll keep you posted on any new research when it comes to Canada's water usage and our potential water crisis moving forward. Thank you.